The average total cost, or ATC projection system, is a smart projection aggregation model. Similar to what Nate Silver does with his political forecasting model over at 538.com, ATC looks at many other projection systems, aggregates them to make the best forecast possible. Since ATC is a smart average, not every projection system is treated equally. Those that are better for homers get more weight in the average. Suppose a player is projected to hit 32 home runs. Well, good luck or bad luck can make that 32 in any one specific season higher or lower. The term for the inherent variance due to sample size is known as process risk. That 32 homer projection is a measure of a player's true talent. But what if that 32 homer projection was wrong? What if his true talent was really 25 homers? What if his true talent was really 40 homers? The term for the uncertainty of the true expectation is known as parameter risk. For some players, projections largely agree with one another. There aren't many differences between them. For some players, projections are all over the place, disagreeing with one another. By measuring the range of the differing projections, ATC allows us to quantify part of each player's parameter risk. Interprojection standard deviation, or inter-SD, is the standard deviation of the underlying projections surrounding the ATC average value. A low inter-SD means that projections largely agree with one another and parameter risk is minimal. A large inter-SD means that projections do not agree very well. That means that a player's parameter risk is heightened. My research has shown that low inter-SD values generally give a higher than expected outcome at the end of the year. A higher inter-SD generally means lower than expected end of the year returns. Interprojection skewness is a measure of how symmetrical projections are around the ATC average. For some players, they're pretty balanced high and low above the average, and their interprojectional skewness, or inter-SK, would be close to 0. If there are one or two outlier projections that are really dragging down the ATC average, and the bulk of projections are above, that interprojection skewness would be negative. If you have one or two outlier projections above where the ATC average lies, and most of the projections lie below the ATC average, you have a positive interprojection skewness. For skewness, my research has shown that negative skewness presents higher than expected values on average at the end of the year, and positive skewness means slightly lower. That means that when you have one or two outlier projections low, they are generally not as right as the wisdom of the crowd's bulk are up above. One other risk that ATC tackles this year is known as categorical or profile risk. If a player is too concentrated in any one of his scoring categories, it might have an outsized impact on the aggregated team overall value. Intra-projection standard deviation is a measure of the dimension of a player's statistical profile. The smaller the intra-SD, the more balanced an individual's player category contributions are. The larger the intra-SD, the more unbalanced the categories are, and the more an absence or bad performance would affect the team's overall composition. So how do we use ATC to minimize risk? If we take the current NFBC ADP and color-code it based on the player's interprojectional standard deviation, we can start to see which players have more inherent risk than others. Let's take a look at the first round to see if we can identify pockets of risk. Take Bo Bichette. Bo Bichette's 3 ATC volatility metrics are a 1.9 inter-SD, a positive 0.54 inter-SK, and a 0.67 intra-SD. That means that by and large, the underlying projections of ATC, they all agree with one another on his pretty high value. His category balance is excellent, meaning that if he is hurt, sure, you lose his fantastic value, but it doesn't stifle you in any one particular category. On the whole, Bichette is a very low-risk player and should be a prime candidate to be targeted with the first few picks of 2022 drafts. The same is true about Kyle Tucker, who exhibits some of the very same risk characteristics as Bo Bichette. Kyle Tucker is a low-risk, late first-round player. In a remarkable season where Shohei Ohtani won the AL MVP, we typically get regression the following year. ATC projections are all over it, showing you a red flag for his parameter risk going into 2022 drafts. That doesn't mean you should not take him in drafts. It just means a word of caution about his risk. If you select Ohtani in the first round, you might want to pad your risk in other rounds by taking safer candidates with lower interprojectional standard deviation later on. Also look at Vladimir Guerrero Jr. He is a first-round candidate, but he has a bunch of risk red flags. His 4.9 interprojectional standard deviation, combined with his positive 0.28 skew, give him more parameter risk than most. What also is a red flag is the 1.41 intraprojectional standard deviation. He is not well balanced categorically. Rather than taking Guerrero in the first round, consider Bryce Harper, who has fewer risk red flags than Guerrero. What about ace starting pitcher for the Dodgers, Walker Buehler? Well, his interprojectional standard deviation at 6.6 is a huge red flag for parameter risk. Some projections project him as a 2.75 ERA pitcher going forward. Some projections have him as a 4.25 ERA going forward. That is a wide difference of opinion, which leads to caution. I'm not saying that you should not grab Buehler in the first round, but if you do, realize that you have taken on more risk than another starting pitcher. Perhaps later on in your draft, you'll want to grab a pitcher like Pablo Lopez, who has a low interprojectional standard deviation, to balance out your risk in the aggregate. With ATC, not only do you get industry-leading projections, but now you get more color on the risk of each and every player.